Hi, and welcome. My name is Paul Deslandes. I am the chair of the History Department at the University of Vermont. And I am so excited to be here today with Dr. Lucy Worsley, who is live from her home in London with us and is here to talk about the current series running on PBS that she is hosting. Many of you may have seen Lucy before on A Very British Romance with Lucy Worsley on PBS or on one of her many BBC shows. She is also an author, and most significantly, her day job is as Chief Curator at Historic Royal Palaces. So welcome to Lucy, and thanks for being with us today. I'm going to ask some questions of Lucy, and we'll have a conversation, but we're also looking for questions from the audience, and as we proceed through our discussion, I will try to feed those questions to Lucy and get you the answers you're looking for. So let me start off, Lucy, by just simply asking you about your role as Chief Curator at Historic Royal Palaces, and ask you to tell me a little bit about how you came to that job, and also just to give us some insight, some dirt on what it's like to work at Royal Historic Palaces.
Well, there's a story I'd like to tell about how I made my way into the world of history, which is that I always loved history at school, but my father is a scientist and he was very keen that I would become a scientist like him. So at the end of high school, I said, okay, I'm going to study chemistry and biology and maths. And I wasn't enjoying it at all. And I got sort of halfway through this course, and there came this day when I changed to history, and I had to go and tell my dad that I'd done this. And he was furious about it. And he said, if you do a history degree, my girl, you will be cleaning toilets for a living. And he's also really fed up of me telling this story now. So I did follow my dream, and I did a history degree. And then I did a PhD in architectural history, actually. And I worked in a different variety of heritage organizations, like the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings and English Heritage, until I made my way to Historic Royal Palaces, which is the independent charity which looks after the unoccupied royal palaces of London. We get no money from the government or the royal family, and we deserve your financial support. Yes, we do. And people often ask me, well, what does your work there include? And basically it's having fun. I don't tell the boss that, but that's really what it is. We, the curators, acquire new treasures for the collection. We work on exhibitions and displays. We do things like the audio guide, write the guidebooks, go out and give history talks, which is what I'm doing now.
Yes.
And also do research into you know what we might present in the future according to the changing needs of our visitors.
Yeah, fabulous. Can you tell us a little bit about how you locate new treasures, how you go about acquiring them, or where you get clues about them from?
Lots of different routes, really. In the good old days before the virus,
Yes, of course.
we actually had an acquisition budget. We're like most museums and heritage organisations, we're in a bad place financially just now, because our visitors, who normally pay for our conservation and education work, cannot visit. Actually, that's not quite true, because as of yesterday, you can come to the gardens at Hampton Court,
Wonderful.
which is a really significant step. There's a long way to go, but that's a really positive thing. So we have our acquisitions budget. Sometimes we buy things at auction. Hopefully we hear that things are coming up and we get word of it beforehand and we do a private deal. Sometimes people give us wonderful things. A whole sort of variety of different routes, I suppose. And it's my job to receive a succession of acquisition proposals from my curatorial colleagues, and we decide which are the ones that are going to add the most value to our collection.
I see. Okay. So a very complex process ultimately when you get right down to it. So.
Well, it's shopping. It's fancy shopping. It's brilliant.
No, it's true. It's true. So tell me a little bit about what excites you about history, because I think one of the things that I always encounter as a professor of history is students who will say to me, well, I didn't find history all that exciting when I was in school, and I've come to university and now I've discovered that there are all sorts of options for historians. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you find exciting and invigorating about the study of history.
Well, I personally think there are three main reasons to study history. And The first of those is pure enjoyment. There's a pleasure, isn't there, about learning about the people of the past and their funny little quirks. And the sort of historian that I am is a social historian, basically. I'm not saying that the history of diplomatic affairs or constitutional history or that sort of thing aren't important. They are. It's just not the sort of historian I am. I like the nitty gritty, dirty detail of daily life. And I know a lot of people who come to Hampton Court Palace really love that too. You know, they think they have to ask questions about the aesthetic of the Baroque or the politics of the Reformation, but what they really want to know about is the toilets. And that's fine with me. There's just the pleasure of the past. But I think you and I would both agree that another reason to study history is the skills that you develop, those skills of analysis and judgment, and the ability to detect when a source is lying to you, which aren't just history skills, are they? They're life skills.
Right, absolutely. And
the third reason that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the sense of perspective that it gives you. So, you know, people often say the past is a guide to the future, which is trite and ridiculous and you know, it holds no meaning really. But what you do get from history is a sense of change over time. Sometimes things get better, sometimes things get worse, but you know, if you're in a bad place, it will get better. And that's a thought that I've been holding on to these last 12 weeks.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a good point to think about history. I've been thinking a lot about history and the history of plagues and pandemics as well. So we are getting some questions, Lucy, so I'm going to pass them on from the audience.
Yes.
The first one I'll ask you is from Lauren, and Lauren asked, who's the one person in history that if you could meet, you would like to meet?
Well.
And she also says that she loves you, Lucy, so.
Excellent taste. And the person I would like to meet is the monarch who said that she might have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. And of course it is Queen Elizabeth I. But I've just got a general soft spot, I guess, for challenging, slightly difficult, sometimes snarky women from history. And I would put Elizabeth in that box. There's nothing fluffy about her. She's indomitable, she's impressive, she's sometimes prickly, she's sometimes nasty. And also in that group, I would actually add my favorite author, who's Jane Austen. You would not want to cross Jane Austen.
No.
Take you to pieces. And also another sort of pandemic person I've been thinking about a lot recently is Florence Nightingale.
Oh, right.
Who in England set up the nursing profession and established, you know, that core of compassionate care of the sick. But what a lot of people don't realise about Florence Nightingale is that she was the most fantastic statistician as well. And she wouldn't have loved the pandemic, but she would have been so helpful in all the modelling and so on that's going on. And then what she did that's really impressive is that she praised and nagged the authorities to try to make things better. So if you read Victorian biographies of these people, you might get a bit of sort of, ooh, a bit scary, a bit snarky, a bit nasty, but that appeals.
Yeah.
Don't know what that says about me, but it appeals.
They often leave the best records too, right? Those folks, they often the best material. We have another question, and this sort of takes us sort of moving more into the subject matter of royal myths and secrets, and particularly the episodes that are airing on Vermont PBS. But we have a question from Eric, who asked if you have a favorite masterpiece theater program, which is sort of the various airing of BBC shows that we have over in the United States.
Hi, Eric. I like your question. And I think, well, I like many of them. I enjoyed Downton Abbey. I enjoyed Poldark. Have you had Poldark yet? I think it's coming if you haven't. But
yeah.
The one I sort of feel particularly caught up in is the show about Victoria. And the reason I've had a little bit to do with that one, I have, visited the set, met the stars. The reason I've had a little bit to do with that one is because one of the historic royal palaces, which my charity looks after, is Kensington Palace, which is Queen Victoria's birthplace and where she grew up in her slightly strange, lonely childhood. And we look after the room in which, aged 18 and 3 weeks, she became the Queen. So the UK premiere of Victoria was held at Kensington Palace. And I'm very good friends with the writer of it, a wonderful woman whose name's Daisy Goodwin. And she has told me the coolest thing, which is that if it ever comes back for another series, which I think is challenging because Jenna Coleman and the stars, you know, they've got so much work on, but if it ever comes back for another series, she's going to write a part for me.
Oh, well.
Yes.
Has she given you a sense of what that part might be?
Maybe Amelia Bloomer, rider of cycles, wearer of trousers. She felt that would be appropriate. So it could still happen that I will go up to their huge fake Buckingham Palace that they have, which is constructed in an aircraft hangar just outside this funny tiny little airport that's called Leeds West International Airport or something, and one plane a day lands there. But in one of their hangars, they've got this amazing recreation of Buckingham Palace, which is where they do all their filming.
Oh, wow, that's fabulous. I'm always intrigued by the sets because sometimes they're really quite, you know, I realize many of the times they're on site, but they're often quite realistic. You can, although occasionally I catch them out when I'm watching and I sort of realize, oh, no, that's not what it looks like.
It's kind of a work of genius because it's been designed to look so good on camera. It looks better than the real thing because the colors are brighter. And outside the windows, which are actually inside the hangar, they shine in these massive lights and everything's got this sort of glamorous glow.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. So we have another question. This one's from Beverly. Oh, this is an interesting one. She says that she personally loves Anne of Cleves, but she's wondering if you have a favorite wife of Henry VIII.
Brilliant question, Beverly. I love this question. I very often find myself in the position of speaking to a group of people like yourselves. And I often throw it back because I think your answer to the question of which of the wives of Henry VIII you prefer reveals a lot about yourself. People tend to vote for the ones who are most like them or that they aspire to be. So personally, I'm a great admirer of the one who was well educated, capable of bearing great responsibility, was trusted by Henry VIII to rule the country when he was absent fighting in France, the one who showed enormous dignity in the face of adversity, courage, integrity, was a good mother to her daughter. I'm talking about Catherine of Aragon, of course. But there are people who'd say, oh, no, you're mad. It's got to be Anne Boleyn. And I would say that you are all self-indulgent, melodramatic narcissists. I'm sorry. Don't hate me.
Interesting choice. I like that. Another question from Patty. This is another sort of asking you to, this is going to be a tough one for you, I think. Which palace is your favorite?
Ooh, I'm sort of contractually obliged not to say. Actually, the answer to that changes over time because we work on different things in different years. So this year, we should have been celebrating the anniversary of the Fields of Cloth of Gold. We were going to have an exhibition about that. And that was a Tudor extravaganza, a big party held in a field outside Calais between Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France in 1520, right? It's 2020. And it was sort of a Tudor version of the Olympic Games, which was another reason for doing it this year, because it was supposed to be the Olympic Games. And the exhibition was about the tournament and the relationship between the two kings and the parties. And in fact, we're doing one of our curator talks about this next Thursday with my colleague, Alden Gregory, who was the curator of that exhibition. So do join us if you want to, the Field of Cloth of Gold talk. But last year, it was all about Kensington Palace because it was the bicentenary of Queen Victoria. It was Queen Victoria's 200th birthday. So we have to sort of roam through the centuries according to where our exhibition program takes us, really. And what tends to happen is that in 2014, we're in the Georgian age because it was 300 years since George I came to the throne. And what tends to happen is that they send us into a new age and we think, oh, this is all strange. And then you get into it and you do the preliminary reading and then you start to, you probably experience this yourself when you move to a new research area. You start to be able to make connections, don't you?
Yes.
And then you think this is the best topic I've ever been involved with. And then you feel really sad when it's time to say Goodbye. As I know that you were just finishing a book, Paul. So
yes, I think the sadness will have to come later. Right now, it would just be elation when it's actually. Let me ask a little bit about royal myths and secrets. So I want you to talk with us a bit about how you came to this as an idea for a series, and also why you think it's important that we kind of dismantle myth, that we think through it critically, because what purpose does that serve ultimately?
Well, what I like about this series is that it's really about historiography, which is not a word that you're basically allowed to use on the television. It means the history of history, the story of the way in which the telling of history has changed over time. And in Britain, okay, the same series is called British History's Biggest Fibs. And fibs is a very sort of twee British word, so we've called it myths for the American version. But the idea is to unpack the conventional sort of schoolgirl narrative and try to see how ownership of the story has changed over time and been manipulated over time. And although there's story there, hopefully there's a little bit of analysis as well, which, like I was saying earlier, is one of the key things that you learn to do on a history degree. You learn the skills as well as the facts, and you are able to judge, analyze, assess, those sorts of things that everybody should be doing the whole time when they're reading a history book. They shouldn't be taking it as gospel. They should be thinking, what's the viewpoint of the author? What agenda do they have? Whose image are they trying to bolster here? And Elizabeth I is a great opener to the series, because she was just such a mistress of what you might call propaganda. You might more sympathetically call it brand management. That's always an essential skill for a monarch, brand management. But you might call it propaganda, you might call it myth-making, you might call it fibbing, but there's something there that we should all know about.
What do you think, what's the most compelling find that you had while doing this series, in terms of uncovering myths, or sort of getting us to rethink the history of the Armada and Elizabeth I's role in that, but also in the history of England in that period?
One thing that actually really comes to mind actually isn't from the Elizabeth episode, it's from the Queen Anne episode. And I had my personal politics changed by this, because one of the achievements of Queen Anne's reign, in conventional terms, is the forging of the union between England and Scotland into Great Britain. Now, I hadn't been into this whole issue before in great detail, but the more I learnt about how this deal was inflicted upon the Scots, the more interested I became. And one of the things we explored in that episode that you'll get the chance to see next Sunday in America is the petitions which were created by Scottish people saying, please, no, don't do this to us. And the bribe that was paid by the government in London to the Scottish establishment, if you like, to go along with this. And there's a referendum in this country for Scotland's wanted to be independent, and at the time of that referendum I think, no, stay with us. But now I can see why the Scottish National Party might actually want to leave.
Interesting.
It was fascinating. I had my own eyes opened there.
Yeah, that's very, it's funny how history can sometimes do that. It can really transform the way you think about current issues, even if you're not necessarily drawing a direct line to the past. You sort of understand that how things arrive at where they arrive at, and I think we're at a moment right now in the United States where we're thinking very seriously about the legacies of our own history, and particularly regarding race and other matters, and understanding history through that lens can be very useful sometimes. Another question, a couple more questions from the audience. So let me go back to those. Beverly asked, are there any more books in the works for you?
Oh, Beverly, thanks for asking. Yes, one of the other sidelines that I have, I admit I'm sort of disgustingly prolific, is as an author of historical novels for kids. So my readers are girls. I'm not supposed to say that. They're for girls and boys, but really they're for girls. Between 11 and 14, who are some of my favorite people in the world. And I've just written one, it's a new one called The Austen Girls, which is about Jane Austen in, as a fictional version of herself. And she becomes a detective and solves a crime. But the two heroines are Jane Austen's nieces, because I have written previously about Jane Austen's life through the lens of the houses in which she lived, a book called Jane Austen at Home. And I've done that because I'm a curator of houses, palaces of fancy houses. And in real life, I came across these two nieces of Jane Austen, to whom she gave advice as they were coming onto the marriage market as teenagers themselves. And as soon as I thought of them, I thought, these are the heroines of one of my novels for younger readers. And the reason I do that work is because it was one of the routes by which I myself came to history. I absolutely have total respect for historical novels as the thin end of the wedge, if you like, as a way of getting people over the threshold and drawing them into the world of history. So I really hope that one of my readers, in quite a few years' time, not immediately, will be sitting in my seat and will be the Chief Curator of Historical Palaces. Not too soon, maybe.
Not too soon, right. Yeah. Any similarities between those nieces and some of the Bennett sisters, or?
Yes, totally, yeah. And also her niece Anna, in particular, was quite a sort of an opinionated, self-confident young lady. A lot of people see echoes of her in the character of Emma Woodhouse.
Ah, of course, yes.
Who's the heroine that Jane Austen said that she had she'd conjured up out of her head, and of whom she said, nobody else will like this woman apart from me.
Very
Jane and me, and quite a lot of other readers as well. But I can see how you say that about her. Another of my prickly women.
Yeah, wonderful. So a question from Rebecca about dressing in period costume, period clothing. She's wondering a little bit about that as a component of your presentation in Royal Myths and Secrets, but also in some of your other presentations. And I'm actually really intrigued by that. And she also asked, do you have a particular outfit that you enjoyed wearing the most? I love personally your wearing of Queen Elizabeth style costume, going through the streets of London, being in a bike cab. I love that. I think that's just brilliant. So, but maybe you can tell us which one is your favorite.
I sort of always suspect that what's behind these questions about dressing up, Rebecca, are the thought, how did it come to this? Who thought that this was a good idea to let this woman do these things? There's an element of total ridiculousness about it, isn't there? But there are three reasons for doing it, I suppose. The first is to indulge my shameless narcissistic love of dressing up. I've always just enjoyed it. That's the second is that when you're making a history program, it costs a lot of money. And generally what happens is the director of the program writes, presenter appears with 50 Roman slaves wearing togas. And after a while, somebody does a calculation and thinks, we can't afford this. I know, let's put Lucy in a sheet. So there's an element of just trying to paint a picture without spending too much money. But the third and more serious reason for taking dress seriously, if you like, is that it is an art form, and it is sometimes a fabulous little window into a lost world. Paul, you and I were talking just before the event started about something that we have at Hampton Court Palace that's called the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection. It's a collection of 10,000 pieces of costume worn by kings and queens and their courtiers and their servants. And it's a brilliant resource for the mentality of people in the past. So one of the strengths of the collection, and this is an outfit that I'm particularly impressed and amazed by, is the 18th century court mantua. And this is a type of dress which has a very tight fitted top half for ladies. And then it spreads out enormously wide at the sides over hoops. They're hoops made out of whalebone, actually. You can probably visualize the sort of thing I'm talking about, not least from period dramas like The Duchess. And it was a sort of a uniform that you had to wear at the Georgian court as a lady. And they were woven with gold and silver thread, partly to sparkle by the light of candles. They're supposed to be seen in low light levels and would really have glinted and glittered in a miraculous way, and partly to demonstrate your wealth. So sometimes when one of these court mantua dresses became outmoded, they would melt it down to get the silver back. and to make a new one. And the reason for the hoop thing is to create really like a huge billboard saying, look how rich my husband is. He's bought me all this silver fabric. They are also ridiculously impractical. They're heavy. You can't go through a door.
Right.
Right. Unless it's a palace door, in which case they fit perfectly. And you can't bend down, you can't pick anything up, you can't hurry. And the point is, you don't need to. If you're rich enough to be wearing one of these dresses, then your job is basically to stand around looking good. So glamorous, but also imprisoning, I would say.
Absolutely. And that raises a question I have about another thing that appears in the series, and it has to do with the use of material culture, the use of material artifacts in studying the past. And I was especially intrigued in the Armada episode about the use of the Armada tapestries and how wonderful those are as historical sources. So maybe you can say a little bit about how we use things like dress and tapestries and furniture and all those other things to understand the past.
Well, these tapestries have a sort of, they existed and then they became a shadow version of themselves that still survives in the Palace of Westminster. So just recent, I don't think it made it into the final program. In the Palace of Westminster, there are these murals recreating these tapestries which have been destroyed that celebrate the victory of the Armada. And the Victorians cared so much about this victory over the Armada that they thought this was the thing to celebrate in the nation's cradle of democratic government. And just recently, some of the missing murals have been recreated by a donor. So people are still thinking it's really important that we celebrate the Spanish Armada, which on one level it's yeah, sure, great, it's a lovely story. But on another level, it's happened a really long time ago, and it didn't happen in quite the totally successful way that you think that it did. So I'm fascinated by that. This nation building is a work in progress in Britain, well, in England, later Britain.
Right.
And we have to do stuff like this because I feel that we're much less well branded as a country than America is with its constitution, right? What's America all about? Oh, it's written down. In Britain, it's not written down. It's famously not written down.
Right.
And I guess what we have in our favor for nation building is a clear geographical boundary and centuries of rule by one institution, the monarchy, but sort of the rest of it is up for grabs in a way that it isn't in America.
That was the thing that really intrigued me about the episode as well, was sort of thinking through national identity, thinking through how history informs how we understand who we are as a people, who we are as a nation. And I thought that came through really nicely in the episode. And it was just a really instructive point, I think, for me as I watched and thought about it. We have another question from Beverly. So let me throw that out there. She's also referencing dress. And could you tell us about some of the imagery in the rainbow portraits of Elizabeth I?
Oh, yes, the rainbow portrait of Elizabeth I, fantastic. The rainbow that she holds kind of looks like a hose pipe because the color of it is faded. But she's holding this rainbow in the portrait to say, I control the weather. That's the symbolism there. She is the sun. She controls the whole of the universe. And she's also got, if you can imagine around the back of her head, this huge gauzy construction that perhaps represents clouds, but it also has the effect, I think, when you look at it, of a rock star coming forwards in a cloud of dry ice. You know, that smoke that they blast out of smoke machines. So imagine rock star stepping onto stage with all the smoke and steam swirling around them. That's what I think her sort of muslin gauze collar behind her head does. And then on the portrait, on the dress itself, there are famously the eyes and ears. They're part of the embroidery on it. Little eyes, little ears. Bit weird, you're thinking. It is weird. But the message is that your queen sees and hears you. She's everywhere. And, you know, that's a very important concept in the 16th century, that someone's got their eye on you. God, also the monarch. For example, when Catherine Howard was giving evidence in her supposed trial. I think I've got this right. She said that she didn't want to talk about what had happened, even when Cranmer was asking her, because she was worried that God would overhear and give her a punishment for it. So the idea that the state is omniscient and omnipresent is something that the Tudors actively cultivated. There's a huge number of pearls on the portrait as well, which represent the moon, which represent virginity, which represent purity. The rainbow portrait isn't the one that's in the episode that we just saw. That's the Armada portrait, but a lot of the same symbolism holds.
How many of the jewels that Elizabeth would have possessed, for example, remain in the royal collection? Are there many, or?
Well, you've got me on this one. I don't have good knowledge of jewels. Some Tudor jewels do survive, like a pearl that belonged to Mary, Queen of Scots, which I think was owned by Elizabeth Taylor for a while. I think that there are something called Queen Elizabeth's earrings or eardrops that form part of the crown jewels, but you're exposing my ignorance.
Oh, no. Sorry, that comes purely out of a question that arose as you were talking. And I think I remember seeing maybe some of Elizabeth's jewelry in the Victoria and Albert, the British rooms that they have, but I could be wrong. Let me ask you a question about personality, because one of the things that strikes me as you go through this episode is the forcefulness, and you alluded to this before, of Elizabeth's personality, and the importance, I think, of interpersonal dynamics and interpersonal relationships in her reign. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about some of those relationships and which ones you found especially illuminating or especially intriguing, I guess.
Well, Paul, with respect, I might have to dispute the terms of your question here, because because you will be aware that Thomas Carlyle set up this idea that the history of the world is the history of great men and their doings.
Right.
And we can include Elizabeth I as an honorary great man, certainly. But really, does the individual and their quirks have that much influence over historical events? We can debate that. We mustn't take it as a given, though. Personally, right. I do think it's very important, and that Elizabeth's character, her intelligence, was a key part of her own success, just like her father's romantic nature was very important to what happened with the Reformation. He was what we would call a serial monogamist. He wasn't content to have mistresses on the side. If he loved a woman, he wanted to marry her, and hence the break with Rome and all the political tumults that happened. But sometimes I think we're guilty as historians of placing what we might read as a person's character too much at the heart of matters. And another thing you've got to be careful of is judging the emotions of the past by the emotions of today. So, notions of romantic love that Absolutely. We might believe in, for example, the Tudors wouldn't have recognized that. No, marriage is about reproduction and property and wealth. I once read the most fantastic little aphorism. Let me see if I can get this right. In Tudor times, marriage began with a financial discussion. It moved to the bearing of children. Then the third stage was falling in love in comfortable old age. Whereas today, we do it the other way around. We fall in love, we bear children, and then we have financial discussions when the marriage falls apart. Controversial, but you've got to admit there's something in that.
Right. Lucy, do you want to give us we only have a minute or two left here, but do you want to give us a preview of what's to come in the next couple of episodes? People have now seen the Armada episode.
Yes, love to. The next one's about Queen Anne, which I was particularly interested in, because a lot of people would say, ooh, Queen Anne, who's she? We don't know about her. But the reason we were allowed to make a whole show about her is because of a film that came out called The Favourite, which starred Olivia Colman, and it was a great success, and people started wanting to know who was she. And she did some extraordinary things, which have been overlooked, partly because of her gender, and partly because of the physical imperfections of her body. She was somebody who had weight issues. There were all sorts of reasons why her achievement has been underrated. And then we move on to Marie Antoinette. The hate figure of French people even to this day. And we've looked a little bit about how that negative judgment of her was also shaped by her being female and being a foreigner in France as well, and how we can perhaps treat her with a little bit more sympathy from the perspective of today.
That's wonderful. Thanks. I look forward to watching those. So, Lucy, this has been an absolute pleasure to chat with you about your work and all your wonderful insights about history. I really have enjoyed it, and I really very much enjoyed the episode. Speaking of the episode, Lucy Worsley's Royal Myths and Secrets begins this Sunday on June the 21st at 8 p.m. on Vermont PBS, and then we'll continue for the next 2 Sundays beyond that. And hopefully in the future, we'll get a lot more of these episodes. But thanks so much, Lucy, for joining us, and thanks for chatting with me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you all.
Same here.
Questions.